Okay, welcome back, WBY. Carl Gallups, thank you for staying with us on the other side of the break. Well, let's get back to the story of Israel. We left off with what happened now after World War II. Then that was about 1945, of course. And then in 1947, the British, who had controlled that area, and they had renamed that area of what we would call Israel, they had renamed it Palestine. Now, in 1947, a couple of years after World War II had ended, the British finally decided they'd had enough of trying to rule that area and dealing with the Jews and the different ethnic groups that lived in the area, and some who had dominated and controlled the area, and then the Jews who were still claiming it, of course, as their ancient homeland and the land of their fathers and the nation that they had had before. The British finally had had enough of it, and they turned control of the area over to the United Nations. And a lot of people don't realize this. And so the United Nations, they divided that whole area into what they called Jewish Palestine and Arab Palestine, based upon population concentrations. Well, the Jewish people accepted the United Nations declaration and division of the land, but the Arabs didn't. Why? Because they wanted it all. They claimed that it was theirs, and the Jews didn't even need to live there. Now, if you've heard the rest of the show today, you know what an out-and-out falsehood that is, what an out-and-out lie it is. But this lie, this falsehood, has continued to be perpetrated and spread by the modern-day news media, and, of course, by the Muslims themselves. And so, as I said, the United Nations divided it, Jewish Palestine, Arab Palestine. The Jews accepted, the Arabs didn't. They wanted it all. Now, because the United Nations had given a certain portion of the Palestine area to the Jews and said, this is Jewish Palestine. Now, what's interesting, some Arabs were living in Jewish Palestine, by the way, peacefully with the Jews. The Jews weren't doing anything to them. But since the United Nations had designated this, then in 1948, on May the 14th actually, the Jewish Palestinians declared themselves independent, and they named themselves Israel. Now get this. It had been the nation of Israel for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, with kings, Saul, David, Solomon, with money, with militaries, with cities, with temples, with international trade. Yes, they had been conquered by other nations throughout the world. What nations hadn't been eventually conquered? Every mighty empire that's ever existed has eventually been conquered by another mighty empire. The Jews were conquered, but that does not negate the fact that they were the first, and by the way, to this day, the only people who had ever lived in that land who had a bona fide, legitimate nation. And now, here it is, 1948, the United Nations has declared, okay, Jews, this section of land right here is yours. Do with it what you wish. And the Jews said, okay, this is cool. We'll reestablish Israel. So on May the 14th, 1948, kind of like our Declaration of Independence and the signing of our Constitution a few years later, we established ourselves, our colonies, and said, okay, we're a nation. We're independent from Great Britain. Well, the Jews did the same thing. They said the UN, the United Nations, the nations united, have given us this land. We will now declare ourselves a new nation. That was May the 14th, 1948. The next day, 7 neighboring Arab nations attacked them. A 19-month war ensued. When the 19-month war had ended, Israel had defeated all of its enemies. But some 400,000 Arab Palestinians, okay, you get the distinction there. They're not Palestinians by some kind of race or ethnicity. That's just what the area was designated by the Roman emperors and then Great Britain and then the United Nations. So the Arabs living in the area, they fled the land in fear of that war. When the war broke out, 400,000 of them left. But Israel won that war 19 months later. So the remaining Arabs that were still there, staying in Israel, they were assimilated really rather peacefully into the Israeli population. To this day, there are Jews and Arabs living all over the nation of Israel. Some neighborhoods are side by side, and they get along just fine. I've been to Israel. I've been in some of those neighborhoods, and there's not a problem. And it's been that way since the inception of the nation in 1948. But the 400,000 or so that fled because of the seeds, became the seeds of the Palestinian liberation movement, and they called themselves the Palestinian refugees. They weren't refugees. They left. Nobody kicked them out. Israel didn't kick them out. It's just that Israel, once it declared itself as a nation, was attacked the next day. And so for 19 months, they were at war with 7 surrounding Arab nations. So the 400,000 Arabs that fled, they said, we want to go back to our homeland. What homeland? They didn't have a homeland. They really weren't even supposed to be in that area anyway. They had their own Arab Palestine. Egypt, in that war, at the end of that 19-month war, they had essentially won, if you will, the Gaza Strip area. And Jordan, remember it used to be called Transjordan, they had won the West Bank area, including Jerusalem. So at the end of that 19-month war, after Israel declared its independence, then there's little Israel, brand new nation. It didn't have the Gaza Strip as a part of it. It didn't have Jerusalem or the West Bank. Now Jordan then granted all of these Arab refugees, the ones that were calling themselves the Palestinian refugees, Jordan granted them full citizenship and gave them the West Bank as their home. Now that should clear up a lot of confusion for people who have been wondering about this for years. What's the deal about the West Bank? And what's the deal about the Palestinians settling the West Bank and Israel building settlements in the West Bank? Well, that's what it's about. Now, let's go up to 1967. In May of 1967, there's another war. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. They plotted against Israel, and they began to mobilize along Israel's border in order to finally eliminate the nation of Israel. But Israel launched a preemptive strike. They found out about it, and they launched a preemptive strike. This is back in 1967. Against Egypt's Air Force. Within 2 hours, they had rendered Egypt's Air Force useless. And the other nations, Jordan and Syria, they didn't know this. They were unaware of it. That's back before the days of cell phones and internet and satellite communications. And so they unleashed their armies into the belly of Israel, coming down from the Golan Heights for a surprise attack, thinking that Egypt was going to back them up. But Egypt had been rendered useless by a surprise attack of the Israelis. After only 6 days of war, this is the infamous 6-day war, Israel had defeated its enemies once again and had reclaimed now the West Bank area and the holy city of Jerusalem, its ancient capital under King David. And in addition, they had captured the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Desert, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Israel now had control of all of that as the spoils of war after they had been attacked, simply attempting to live peacefully in the land. But unfortunately, you see, the rest of the world didn't see Israel as a winner claiming its rights to spoils of war, but rather Israel was considered to be, of all things, an occupier. Now the 850,000 Arabs living in the Gaza Strip joined with the former Arabs who were expelled during the War of 1948, who left. They weren't expelled, but who left during the War of 1948 and who had declared themselves once again refugees. And they all joined together from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, and they said, we're refugees. We're Palestinian refugees, and we vow to destroy Israel and to retake our land. Folks, do you smell the hypocrisy and the lies of this? Supported by the Muslim world, supported by much of the European world, supported by much of the anti-Semitic press. Isn't this amazing once you know the truth of what really happened? Then, of all things, after Israel now has recaptured Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Jerusalem, in 1982, at the Camp David Peace Accord, the United States of America Jimmy Carter persuaded Israel to give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Give it back in exchange for peace. But the Arabs were still not satisfied. Even after Israel gave up the land, the Arabs were still not satisfied, and they still declared that they were going to annihilate Israel. What many people today don't know is that many of these so-called Palestinian refugees, they were expelled by Jordan in the 1970s and the 1980s because of continual clashes with the Jordanian authorities and the military. And those so-called refugees that Jordan had taken in with open arms were troublemakers. They were thugs and terrorists and militants. And so Jordan expelled them. And of course, out of that expulsion from Jordan grew this thing called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, eventually headed by Yasser Arafat, who's now dead. But ever since then, the PLO has been recognized by all the Arab nations, and at times even the United States, as a legitimate authority with which to hold talks and try and sign treaties with. But in reality, the PLO and the Palestinian refugees, in reality, they're terrorist thugs with which even Jordan did not want to deal. Is there no wonder why Israel gets so upset with the United States when we give the Palestine Liberation Organization and its resulting terrorist branches this kind of legitimization? Is it no wonder? It would be as though Israel recognized Al-Qaeda as an independent nation or a sovereign legitimate authority with which the U.S. should negotiate with. And it would be as if Israel was always dogging us to negotiate with Al-Qaeda because, after all, Al-Qaeda have legitimate concerns, and these are legitimate people and maybe even a legitimate nation. That's how Israel feels when we and other nations urge it and encourage it and sometimes even force it to deal with the PLO and its resulting organizations. It's absolutely astounding, folks. It's absolutely amazing. And during the past decade, Israel gave the land, evacuating South Lebanon in 2000. You remember that? They left South Lebanon, wherein they had been being attacked from terrorist organizations of Lebanon to its northern borders. They gave that up in 2000 at the urging of the world. And then in 2005, do you remember? They gave up the Gaza Strip. And what did it get Israel? Nothing but an intensification of belligerence and militarization of the enemy side, multiple kidnappings and cross-border attacks and rocket attacks, unrelenting. Is there any wonder why Israel shrugs its shoulders and throws up its hands and says, "What's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world around us?" So today, much of the world, almost all the world, I guess, except for the United States, at times anyway, and Great Britain, still considers Israel to be an occupier of the land. Up until just recently, the United States has been the greatest and biggest and best ally of Israel, and Israel certainly has been a huge ally of ours and a great, important strategic friendship in the Middle East. And the battle rages on. Historic Israel is back in the land as a nation, just as the Bible had long before predicted would happen. Now, it's been attacked by enemies time and time again, and it's never been defeated. It's still there, coming back to the land in 1948 as a nation. Now, when we get back from the break, I'm going to share some astounding information with you from the Bible concerning the prophecy of all of this that we've just discussed, as well as end-time prophecies of how Israel is a pointing sign to what is getting ready to happen in the world. Folks, there is a coming World War III. I hope it's not in our lifetime, but it's coming, and you can see it brewing, and you can see it brewing in the Middle East, and you can see that Israel is at the center focus of it all. And the Word of God for thousands of years has told us that this was going to happen. On the other side of the break, I'll give you the details.